Special bioethics presentation this morning. I'm Karen Rizek. I'm the director of the Ethics Institute at Kent Place. And I'm very excited about this morning because we're joined by our bioethics students. And so as we begin, I would like for the students to introduce themselves, the students who will be doing the presentations today. So we'll start with Sammy.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sammy Schaub. I'm a senior right now, but I took bioethics in sophomore year.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Anaya. I'm a senior as well, and I took bioethics my junior year.
Hi, I'm Serena, and I took bioethics last year when I was a sophomore.
Hi, everyone. I'm Abby. I'm a junior, and I'm taking bioethics right now.
Hi, I'm Liz. I'm also a junior, and I'm also taking bioethics this year.
And we're also joined by my colleague, who is the co-teacher of the bioethics project, Lisa Goldman. Lisa, why don't you say hello?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope you enjoy this morning's presentations.
And finally, I am also joined by my two colleagues in the Ethics Institute, Ms. Sykes and Ms. Sheehy. Ariel?
Hi, everyone. Glad to see you all.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone here today.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to share my screen. And again, welcome everyone to our Ethics Institute Parent Workshop on Bioethics. Before we begin, I always like to start by reminding everyone or telling everyone what the mission of the Ethics Institute at Kent Place School is. It's to promote a process and practice of ethical decision-making in primary and secondary school communities. So we don't just teach about ethics, we teach a process for ethical decision-making, and we empower our students to use this process in all aspects of their lives. And today you'll see how they utilize the ethical decision-making process in some really big issues that impact all of our lives. And the second part of our Ethics Institute mission is that we are here to serve the primary and secondary school communities. And so all the constituents, the students, the faculty, the staff, the administrators, the board, and most importantly, you, the parents. So it's when we collaborate and when we work together to create an ethical climate for our students that they can truly achieve the goal of being the ethical decision makers for today and for the future. The first half of our program, or when the students present, we're being recorded. But once they're finished their presentations, we're going to stop recording and we're going to ask that you participate. And so here are the conversation norms that we utilize here at the school when we ask for participation. So please remember to speak your truth and listen to understand others, not to debate. Understand the impact of what you're saying versus the reason why you're saying it, your intent. When possible, seek to call in instead of calling people out. Consider when to step forward and when to step back. And finally, show leadership by taking positive risks and practicing empathy. Okay, so as I just mentioned, today's agenda, I'm going to speak very briefly about what the Bioethics Project is. And then we are going to talk about a really big question: what is the value of life? And the 5 topics from each of our 5 students who will give a brief description of the issue or topic that they focused on. And they're going to challenge our thinking. And then we'll have a discussion about some of the topics that they raised for us today. The goal of today is a greater understanding and awareness of the ethical challenge that we all face as a society in the field of bioethics. So very briefly, the Bioethics Project this year is celebrating its 10th anniversary, which is truly incredible when I think about it. It is our signature program of the Ethics Institute, and it was originally started with a collaboration with the Hastings Center for Biomedical Research, and now it's a partnership and a collaboration with Georgetown University's Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And basically, the goal of the Bioethics Project is to empower our bioethics students. And there's a difference, by the way, between scholar and student. The scholars are the ones who complete the program. The students are the ones who are in it. And in order to become a bioethics scholar, what you do through the project is you learn from experts in the field about a topic that is pertinent to bioethics. So this year, it's bioethics, small world, big challenges. And then the students embark on a journey of real academic scholarly research with the help of a mentor from Georgetown University. And they choose a topic of interest and they write a very, very lengthy paper about that topic of interest, where they ask the ethical questions about the issue and then they seek to answer the ethical question. And so again, utilizing that decision-making process. But the most important part about the Bioethics Project is not just to help the students in the program to become bioethics scholars, but for them to then educate the rest of the community about these issues that are of great importance to all of us who live in our 2021 world. And so that's part of what we're doing today. They are going to take what they've learned and the questions that they still have and engage us in a really interesting conversation about some of life's greatest challenges. And so we're going to start off with Sammy Sharp, who, as she just mentioned, she's a senior and she is a Bioethics Project scholar from 2020. So Sammy, why don't you begin and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Hi, everybody. So as I said, I took bioethics in my sophomore year, and my year of the bioethics course, the theme was being human in a brave new world. So with that theme, my central question for the project that I explored throughout the year was, is prenatal screening for Down syndrome ushering in 21st century eugenics? So I really focused on analyzing the ethical implications of preventing the birth of babies with Down syndrome through the usage of prenatal screening technology, or PNS. And so throughout the project, one of my main goals was to really break down my own preconceived notions about Down syndrome and to better understand both perspectives on why we should or should not prevent the birth of babies with Down syndrome. And so throughout the year, I kind of centered my analysis of the pertinent ethical dilemmas through looking at 4 main stakeholders. So I looked at genetic counselors or physicians, parents, the Down syndrome community, and then society as a whole. At the beginning of the year, of course, my research was centered around understanding Down syndrome and prenatal screening technology. So I looked at, and I really dove into understanding the genetic causation of Down syndrome, and then the different physical manifestations and the intellectual impacts of having Down syndrome. And the most memorable part of this aspect of the research was that I came to understand that Down syndrome is really a spectrum of capabilities. And I was also able to understand how many advancements have been made recently in the treatment of Down syndrome, and that a 1-year-old now with Down syndrome will have a life expectancy of over 60 years. And then I also looked at what prenatal screening is, the different forms of PNS, and I dove into understanding how, when, and why prenatal screening is utilized during a pregnancy. And so with that background, I was able to look at each stakeholder individually, and I really thought about the key values and principles that apply to each stakeholder. And then I was able to put everything together and see where the conflicting values may lie in this ethical dilemma. And so I don't want to talk about every stakeholder because that would take like 4 hours. But so I thought I would just talk about the most interesting stakeholder for me, which was definitely looking at the role of genetic counselors, because I really worked to unpack how implicit bias can conflict with the value of non-directiveness in genetic counseling. And I thought about how our social construct and our view of those with Down syndrome implements implicit bias into genetic counselors' advice. So I really remember looking at the language used by genetic counselors and how there's even implicit bias and negative connotations in common phrases like "I'm sorry" or "unfortunately, I have bad news to share" when genetic counselors are informing a family of a diagnosis of Down syndrome. And so at the very end of my ethical analysis, I was able to put all my research into a historical perspective, and I compared current prenatal screening practices to the eugenics movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I looked at comparing the accuracy of science in both timeframes, the different societal attitudes, and then the degree of autonomy of those during the eugenics movement and those who chose to undergo prenatal screening nowadays. And really the main question I was trying to look at during this historical part of my project was whether society encourages prenatal screening to detect Down syndrome because we still adhere to the attitudes that prevailed during the 19th and 20th centuries during the eugenics movement. So I was trying to see, why is Down syndrome regarded as objectively bad or undesirable? And of course, these are really big questions that nobody, I never came to a final answer on, but placing the research into historical context allowed me to have a better understanding of where our societal views of disease and disability do come from. So that's just a brief summary of some of the research that I dove into throughout the year. And at the end of the project, there are, of course, still many questions that I wish I could have unpacked, which we will be discussing and hopefully looking into later. So one of the main questions was, what are the ethical differences between not implanting an embryo with Down syndrome or aborting an embryo with Down syndrome? So I really wanted to look at how the ethicality of the issue changes as the means of prevention changes. And then lastly, what are other aspects of one's identity that could be seen as a target for prenatal screening, and how could this lead to 21st century eugenics? Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Sammy. So we're going to come back and have a chance to discuss further. Sammy will lead us in a little discussion about the questions that she's just posed for us. But as I mentioned, we're going to go through all 5 presentations first and then go to the Q&A. So that was excellent. And I believe now we are going to go to our next presenter, who is Anaya Kapoor. It's not going. So Bioethics Project Scholar from last year. She's also a senior. Anaya?
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here to speak to you all. Like I said, my name is Anaya Kapoor. I'm a current senior, and I participated in the Bioethics Project last year, and the theme was the principle of justice, preserving human dignity, which was a very broad theme. And so for me, when I started doing research and the process of picking a topic, I actually looked to my passion that I found in history classes, which was looking at economic inequality on a global scale within developed and developing nations. So that's kind of where my topic came out of, and I ended up actually researching the obligations of developed nations to developing nations in ensuring the right to health or the right to flourishment, as stated in the Human Declaration of Independence, along with accessibility in terms of dealing with pandemics, epidemics, which is obviously a very prevalent point in our time right now. So basically, to start off with my project, I decided to go from a case study angle, which honestly is very similar to how Sammy looked at the historical basis. But the case study that I chose to write a good portion of my paper on was that of the Ebola epidemic. So with the epidemic, one of the main ethical causes or ethical issues that came up was the fact that many Americans at the time were airlifted out of West Africa, where the epidemic was most prominently happening, and treated with experimental therapies and medicines that those dying in West Africa did not. And this was a really prominent time in our history where we saw a blatant inequality in accessibility to health treatment and accessibility to healthcare. So for me, when I was researching this, I realized that there was an injustice in how developing nations were getting accessibility to resources, and the slippery slope that this went down for me as a human was the value of life when you're looking at it globally, and how do we weigh the value of life? And is it really ethical to weigh the value of life differently when you're born in a different nation? Is that basis for how your accessibility to health differs? Is that a basis for how you should have an accessibility to a vaccine or healthcare? So naturally, there are many economic intertwines that I researched in relation to this case, one being that of the natural exploitation of developing nations that has unfortunately occurred because of the power of developed nations. So if you look at Bangladesh, for instance, with their factory system, they are very, very dependent and incumbent on developed nations to pursue their economy and for a livelihood. However, many of us know the infamous factory collapse which occurred in Bangladesh, and that resulted in a loss of lives, but mainly because they did not have the healthcare infrastructure to care for those who were injured. So in my research, I found that actually, because of the way that these nations are dependent on developed nations, it actually falls upon developed nations to help in these cases where the right to health is compromised. So many of the stakeholders I look to revolved around developing countries. So the citizens, their lack of health, the governmental leaders, many of these nations do not have the government infrastructure to care for their citizens. And then the healthcare workers and systems, which are often unable to meet the demands of their citizens because they're understaffed and overworked. And then similarly, I looked at developed countries. I looked at economic corporations, which have practices in developing countries. I looked at healthcare workers and systems here, along with governmental leaders. And then globally, I looked to this idea of being a global citizen. So we all, regardless of where we live, have some stake in what happens globally and as a human itself. So how do we create these universal human rights and determinants to health? The WHO, organizations that can really enforce regulations and equal standards, and then once again, human rights organizations. So one of the quotes that I think encompasses, as I kind of go into my value analysis, developed nations' tendency to just utilize their privilege and overlook the issues that are happening in developing nations is actually a quote by Bill Gates, in which he says, "Perhaps the only good news from the tragic Ebola epidemic is that it may serve as a wake-up call. We must prepare for future epidemics of diseases that may spread more effectively than Ebola," which obviously is very pertinent because COVID-19 did happen after that. But I think the consensus of that quote in my analysis was that we're willing to receive the wake-up call for all of these epidemics, but we're reluctant to answer them. So we can have the phone ringing that there's inequalities, there are people dying, that they do not have accessibility to health, but as individuals, we don't make the effort to answer that call and to take preemptive action in order to prevent it for the future. So really, with my ethical analysis of the dilemma, I worked off of the assumption that everyone has an interest in improving health status and outcomes on a global scale. And then I really looked at the principle of justice. And I looked how individuals all have the equal capability to health, and deprivations in this right are really unjust because they reduce the capability for an individual to exercise their agency, their autonomy, and their right to health in the first place. And this is really why, for all of us, the principle of justice appeals to humans, because regardless of where you live, we have an intuition that human life must be treated equally. And we can also look at health justice through a legal lens. So right now, there's little to no legal obligations or requirements for developed nations to aid developing nations in global health justice, and there's no really sense of shared moral responsibility. So in that sense, this lack of health justice can be seen as really a failure to pay attention to public health and a comment on society's larger concentration on economic development as opposed to that of health. And then the next thing I looked at was really this juxtaposition of accountability and autonomy. So one of the main counter arguments I came up with when I was looking at my stances and doing research was that developed nations have the autonomy to decide what they want to do with their resources, and naturally, if they do not want to, put their efforts and economic resources into creating health infrastructures for developing nations, then they shouldn't have to. But I actually found that this was really just an inherent disregard for justice and a disacknowledgement really of health rights of other countries. So whether in the Ebola epidemic or in COVID-19, we can really see that we're only as strong as our weakest link. So if one country does not have the resources to adequately deal with an outbreak, then really all of our health is at stake. So this idea of autonomy, I think, when you're talking about global health rights, really is diminished, because we do have to hold nations accountable because our own health rights are compromised in such an interconnected and globally responsible world. And then lastly, I look to ethical treatment and paternalism. So if we do go in and implement health infrastructures, should we be sure as developed nations that we're not imposing on the practices that many of these nations have, and that we're not going in with a mindset that simply because we're more advanced in a certain field that we have more knowledge and therefore we have to impose it on their participants, which I know is a big concern with testing on developing nations, and that has roots in a lot of colonization and imperialist efforts. So really, that's kind of most of the basis of my case. I did touch on morality, but some of the further questions I had were in an age of COVID-19, when we're looking at what is the most productive way to move forward? Do we see that vaccine allocation is more necessary, or healthcare infrastructures? Because as we can know, you can give a nation as many vaccines, but if they don't have the infrastructure to adequately allocate that, is that beneficial? Is that ethical? I look to global governance. Is that a plausible solution given that each nation has their own autonomy, sovereignty? And then I also looked at, which is really one of the broad questions of today, the value of life, and what does the right to health look like, and how do we weigh the value of life based on geographical location? So thank you so much.
Amazing. We're so proud of our bioethics scholars and students, I have to say. I mean, these are, again, and these are issues that are relevant for all of us. And so thank you, Anaya. So now we're going to go to Serena Zhang. Serena was a bioethics scholar from last year's program, and she is currently a junior.
Hi, I'm Serena, as Dr. Rizek said, and my project topic last year was called Consequences and Conscience, the Ethical Pitfalls of Justifying Unethical Conduct Using Consequentialism. And the ethical question I decided to focus on was, should the possibility of a positive outcome ever justify present-day unethical research conduct? And what prompted this was that we always hear the phrase, and what prompted this was that we always hear the phrase progress is made for sacrifices, but we really don't know what that means, even if we just say it all the time. And in order to understand that question and possibly answer it, I approached it using the lens of scientific advancement, considerations of virtue ethics, which focuses on intent, and then consequentialism, which focuses on consequences, and the idea of human guinea pig culture. So in terms of scientific advancement, I focused on one historical human challenge trial, and just for background information, a human challenge trial is a experiment in which humans are experimented on, and I also focused on its connections to the COVID-19 vaccine trials. So the monster studies happened in 1939, and it was a stuttering experiment run by Dr. Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor, in which they performed stuttering experiments on 22 orphan children at the Sailors' Orphans Home, and the result was that the children were traumatized, and that many of them, after becoming adults, were still traumatized and unable to talk. And the next case I decided to focus on was the COVID-19 vaccine trials, and I don't think we really need any reminder about what is going on, so I will just focus on a specific instance that I focused on. So in the UK last year, they focused on distributing the first dose of the vaccine to as many people as possible and possibly postpone the second dose. And even though there was no data about the effects of postponing the second dose, they still went ahead and did it. And of course, this is extremely risky because there are elderly populations and immunely compromised populations whose medical problems might inhibit their ability to become immune. So that definitely struck a lot of controversy. And then while these two events may seem so different, they're actually really connected, and I focus a lot on that. So as the children were only told that they would receive speech therapy, we aren't really told much information besides that the vaccine is good for us and that you should get the vaccine to get back to what you love. We are constantly bombarded with these slogans, and there's also a lot of social pressure and coercion. And there's also last year especially, there was a lot of giving away of free stuff, free lottery tickets, free donuts after showing your vaccine card. And I won't go into the ethics of coercion because that's another topic. That is certainly something I looked into. And then in terms of ethical considerations, I looked at these two case studies and my question using virtue ethics, which states that something may be ethical depending on whether or not the person performing the possibly unethical conduct had good intent. So for example, in the monster studies, the doctor running it, Dr. Wendell Johnson, suffered from stuttering since he was a little kid, and he was constantly bullied and wanted to find a cure for stuttering so people wouldn't have to be bullied. But at the same time, there's a slippery slope here because we don't know what people's true intent is and who decides what good intent is and what bad intent is. And then moving on to idea of consequentialism, which states that the ends justify the means. In the COVID-19 vaccine trials, the obvious benefit would be that a majority of people can gain some degree of immunity, but at the same time, we don't know if that's going to happen. So going back to my main ethical question, so the possibility of an uncertain possible positive outcome ever justify present-day unethical research conduct? And then lastly, I looked at the idea of human guinea pig culture, which is in which humans are repeatedly used as test subjects. And what I mean, as my conclusion, I mentioned that human guinea pig culture is based on the idea that people are constantly engaging in unethical conduct for the greater good, for say. And however, even if we stop using unethical measures, it doesn't mean that human guinea pig culture will cease to exist, because it is inevitable, as the favorable outcome will always be used to justify possibly unethical conduct. And of course, there's also the question of who determines what even is ethical, and whose perspective do we listen to, because there are so many, and we can't, and because of the contrasting nature of perspectives, we can't really combine everything to some global perfect solution. And yes, I also have a discussion question for later, as Dr. Risa had said, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Serena. I was so intrigued by the concept or the thought of human guinea pig culture. I think that's a fascinating topic, and one that I look forward to having a further discussion about shortly. So next, we will have two of our students who are currently involved in the project this year. And so Abby Wall is a junior, and they have not delved into their topics of interest to the extent, because they're just getting ready to pick their topic. They're just getting ready to be assigned a mentor. And so after listening to numerous experts over the last few months, the students are zeroing in on a topic of interest. So we'll now hear from Abby Wall, who is currently a junior.
Hi, everyone. I'm Abby. And as I mentioned, I'm a junior and am in bioethics this year. This year, our theme is Global Bioethics, Small World, Big Challenges. And as Dr. Rizak mentions, our class has not picked out our topics officially, so I'm not going to go into a super deep level of analysis, but I am excited to share my research. So right now in bioethics, I'm working on dissecting and discussing the role of the canary in the coal mine in various different bioethical issues. The term canary in the coal mine was first explained to our class by watching a video of a Down syndrome activist. The speaker, Frank Stevens, was speaking on a panel at the UN. Stevens spoke on the topic of Down syndrome rights and their roles in society. We used this video to introduce us to the ethical issue of prenatal screening for Down syndrome and the effects it's having on places such as Denmark, where it's custom to, if a mother finds out that her baby has Down syndrome, they terminate the pregnancy. In 2019, there were only 18 people with Down syndrome living in Denmark, and Stevens called this phenomenon a canary in the eugenics coal mine. This phrase, canary in the coal mine, was coined in the late 1980s when miners would send a canary bird into the coal mine before the actual miners went in, since the canary was sensitive to the dangerous toxins in the mine. They would die after being exposed to them. Them dying acted as the first sign of warning. So this helped tell the workers whether it was safe or not to continue. So attributing this idiom to the topics of bioethics issues, I've connected the subject to the topic of prenatal testing for Down syndrome and euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. So the slippery slope of Down syndrome prenatal testing and terminations begs the question, what kind of lives are worth living? The fact that it's a cultural norm to terminate a pregnancy when the baby has a very common non-terminal genetic mutation represents a danger that choosing the perfect child could cause. In class, we had lots of discussions and slippery slopes that these issues bring up, including the right to autonomy and the right to choose how a mother reacts to her pregnancy. However, we can't ignore historical connections and red flags that this ethical issue poses. So moving on, I'll continue my research and time in this class when we had a speaker named Mark Conrad who talked about physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. He is a physician and medical worker who specialized in treating patients that requested medical aid in dying and physician-assisted suicide. And Dr. Conrad brought up the global issue that Belgium is going through right now, where it added euthanasia to its list of available requests for patients to make. The Belgian parliament legalized euthanasia on May 28th in 2002. Conrad brought up the issue on how this issue acts as the first red flag and slippery slope to where our society could possibly diminish our view of deaths and murder due to its potential legality across the world. And we asked the question, where do we draw the line? So I saw similarities in these two cases revolving around cultural norms, autonomy, and justice. And now I'm really excited to continue my research on how countries should react to these canaries in the coal mine. So some questions I'm posing to you all are the following. Is it responsible for the country to take action? Should they develop their ethical stance? Should it be the responsibility of other countries to get involved? Who are the major stakeholders in swinging one way or the other? And are we responsible to end the problems before they start to get too bad? When can we pull the plug on the whole operation, and who gets to decide? So I'm in the process of researching specifically Denmark and Belgium, as well as opposing countries, to try to understand the morals and intent behind the actions that the countries have taken, as well as how the citizens have responded. And this will also be really interesting thinking about the future, because knowing the patterns of how these countries act when they see these red flags will allow me to foreshadow and possibly predict future developments and actions, especially during this pandemic. I'm so excited to continue working through my ethical questions, and I'm so glad to have been able to have the opportunity to present to you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. It's very interesting, and the connection between pre-birth and at death, the whole spectrum of life, and the question of the value of life and where we're going as a society. So thank you, and I look forward to your further research. Finally, Liz Kadekel is also currently in the class and is a junior. And so Liz, let's hear about what your topic of interest is currently.
Okay, hi everyone. So as Dr. Rizak said, I'm Liz and I'm a junior. I'm currently in the bioethics project, so we haven't really picked out our official topics. I'm not going into any super deep levels of analysis, but I am learning a lot about the issues I want to explore. So one in particular that has stood out to me has been waiting times in emergency rooms and urgent care facilities, specifically how patients are prioritized normally or in emergent situations, and how the doctor-patient relationship is affected. This year's theme is global bioethics in a small world, so I also think it would be interesting to look at how these factors may differ by country. So in class, I recently completed a presentation on the waiting times in the UK for planned surgeries and how the COVID pandemic has pushed them back by months. I was interested in looking at this because one of our speakers, Dr. Aguila, that we had a little while ago, discussed and educated us on waiting times on a bigger scale and how insurance in the US has impacted the doctor-patient relationship. He actually started a program on a smaller scale where he offers community service hours in exchange to covering surgery costs. So I found out while researching the situation in the UK that the goal is for 95% of patients to be seen within 4 hours, but it has dropped to 69% in Wales as of June 2021, and as low as 43 or 44% in other areas. My main ethical question that I discussed was, is it ethical to drastically postpone standard non-emergency patients in unprecedented medical circumstances? So I really looked at how COVID impacted the statistics of the hospital wait times. I also explored a specific case of a woman named Jill in Wales, who she was diagnosed with hip arthritis in 2016, but she was only referred to a hip consultant in December of 2020, a whole 4 years later. So after seeing the consultant, she was put on a 3-year-long waiting list to get her surgery. And at that point, it was increasingly painful for her. She really lacked mobility in her hips. And she actually did some research and decided to travel to Lithuania, where there's also free healthcare like the UK. And she contacted a clinic and got her procedure finished in under a month. So being that her waiting process started before the COVID crisis, it caused me to wonder about different factors that contribute to waiting times in hospitals. So I identified patients and doctors as my stakeholders, and also corporate hospital positions as stakeholders, because that's sort of where the burden of responsibility falls on determining how hospitals function and what decisions are made in times of certain emergencies. I applied the values of justice and non-maleficence. I wanted to focus on the point that ultimately patients should receive the same standard of healthcare all around. But obviously, just thinking about it, it seems nearly impossible because of the allocation of scarce resources and just the amount of people constantly needing some form of medical treatment in society. So trying to apply the framework of utilitarianism here is hard because the greater good of the patients comes with many consequences. Going forward, I want to explore more factors that contribute to this. And one question I've asked myself is how this workload affects the mental state of healthcare workers, especially with COVID-19. Compassion fatigue is affecting many doctors and nurses. And we actually had speakers come and talk to us about compassion fatigue and how it's really impacted their working state. So it's interesting to consider the autonomy of a patient who has a right to be cared for versus the capability of a doctor and the capacity to actually care for the patient. Another question I have is if waiting times differ by country and what factors determine this. I was thinking of free healthcare versus not free healthcare, rural versus urban countries, and socioeconomic patterns in different countries. And also, it would be interesting to explore the idea of medical tourism, which is traveling to another country for accessible treatments. There's also a lot of factors that come out of this, such as should the tourists be prioritized over native citizens, and how different countries' healthcare translates to the country that the patient is traveling to. So I'm still going through the process of researching and looking at ideas, but I can't wait to further explore this year. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. I want to welcome Ms. Crow, Maura Crow, who just came on. I know she was teaching class till 9:30. And Maura is also the other teacher with Lisa and I in the Bioethics project. Okay, so we're going to turn off the recording.